Well, we're here at Pilot Knob and our camp is set up and we're ready for the evening. So as far as the purpose of our camp out, we have some specific training objectives. We want to increase our familiarity with nature, becoming comfortable in our Father's house. We want to apply Scripture to practical life. We want to connect with history. And we want to cultivate skills for sustenance in times of trouble. Now, one issue that's been a matter of discussion and that has been brought up for active training is camp security. Obviously, in times of serious danger, camp security becomes a very high priority. Right now, we're in a setting of peace where there's minimal threats from wild animals, but we're here, we're free to operate within the law to the extent of our knowledge. We're not highly worried about criminals attacking us while we're camped here. But we want to think ahead to times when those might be significant issues and prepare our minds for that. So there's a couple kinds of guards. One is your actual watchman who has to stay awake and spend his full time watching for trouble. And then there's the reactive guards who simply respond when trouble arises. And most of the time we're in that reactive mode where we try to be aware of potential dangers, but we don't know of any immediate dangers. And due to the difficulty of posting guards full time, we just don't do it. But we still want to be ready to react quickly if there is an emergency. Working in the fire department and the ambulance, I've gotten some practice at quick reaction. So you have to learn to be streamlined, minimize the number of steps you have to take, and go through them smoothly. So in a camp setting like this, if we were to have an attack from an animal or a human or something during the night, there are a few things that we need to be aware of. One is noise and light discipline. It's always an advantage for the attacker to not know who's responding. So we want to be able to get up quickly, quietly, and without turning on a lot of lights. And without doing a lot of rustling around. So to facilitate that, we want to keep our boot laces tucked into our boots. That way we can put them on like slippers and be able to get out and move quickly. In a real danger situation, you sleep with your shoes on and change your socks at least once a day, if not twice a day. You just change, you don't undress. In our case, we're leaving people free. When we do undress to sleep, it's good to be orderly in how we undress. We want the first thing we take off to be at the bottom of the pile, and as we undress, each item is laid on the pile so that if we need to get up, we can just go to the pile without turning a light on and pick up one item after another and put it on. So we should be able to locate our clothing without turning a light on. If we need to use a light, we'll consider covering the light with our hand and just allowing enough light out to see what we need to see without exposing the full beam of the flashlight. We need to have our light and whatever weapon we choose quickly available, even more available than our clothing. It needs to be right there where we can control it, where we realize if anyone is messing with it, and where we can consistently find it without a lot of fumbling. So in case of alarm, if someone screams or if they blow their whistle or fire a firearm during the night, the entire encampment should rise and rally to the defense. This should be done as swiftly and quietly as possible with light discipline and whatever noise discipline we can manage. But the point is to be up and in action before we alert others to our actions to the extent possible. Then when we're ready to move, then we can focus on either relieving the person who is sounding the alarm, or else we can all rally to the central camp location, which would be our main shelter, our community shelter. Food storage. For this time, we're storing our food in the back of the pickup with a canopy. So it's not highly secure, but it's set in where it shouldn't be intruded upon by rodents, and where the vehicle itself is somewhat of a deterrent to bears. Remember in 2017 when we were camped out at a camp meeting, we had a table set up that we had various items laid out on, and during the night we heard some rustling around, and the tree squirrels had come out and were exploring our belongings. And later we found, the janitors found a number of bottles of essential oil and who knows what 50 feet away over at the latrine. For some reason it seems the squirrels had carried the little bottles and whatever over to the porta potty and left them there. And I think we got them all back, which is amazing. Then we had the rattlesnake in camp too, but that was another story. Ended up having to go down and borrow a hoe because we didn't have a staff in camp. So we went and borrowed a hoe and took care of the rattlesnake. Okay, so let's look at the shepherd's tripod. What is the primitive shepherd's basic elements? He has these three elements. The first one, he has to watch the sheep. He has to be there basically all the time to just be aware of their needs, supply those needs, and deal with any threats. Probably the biggest threat is simply the sheep's own stupidity. Can't find his way around the corner. But the sheep is a helpless animal. And it's the same with us. We are our own worst enemy. But the sheep is also a predator magnet. So there's that occasional threat that appears suddenly and fiercely. and stealthily. It has to be watched for continually. Okay, active defense. What does the shepherd have?
A rod.
The rod, the
Staff.
sling.
Sling.
Those were the ones David had available to him. They're pretty, around the world today, they're still common in primitive countries. Obviously, when possible, shepherds usually have rifles, shotguns, whatever. What about passive defenses?
Combat, hand to hand.
Passive.
Passive, okay.
It's like a sheepfold.
Right. Yeah. Protective, a gate.
Well, it's a whole fortress, basically, that can be defended by one person. So you have that element of fencing and roofing that keeps predators from climbing in over the walls, hopefully. But at least walls. It contains the sheep, and it gives the shepherd a position from which he can defend them when they're in there. A good sheepfold would allow the shepherd to sleep just outside the compartment where the sheep are and guard that with his presence, so that anything wanting to get to the sheep would find the easiest path to be right over him.
Is that what Jesus meant when he said, I am the door?
Mm-hmm.
That you have a picture you draw of the sheepfold, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of.
The Hebrew letter Pei,
Well, I don't know about the Hebrew letter, but anyway.
you just drew it upside down.
Oh,
That's good though. Okay, so here's the Hebrew
Jesus,
letter Pei.
Hey.
Mm-hmm. If it doesn't have the dot in the middle, it says it's Fe. So it's similar to our PH. As you can see here, here's your porch area. The door goes here. I'll draw it like that just for purposes of illustration. But the shepherd can camp in here. If he wants his campfire out here, he can put a campfire out in the entrance. And that keeps him warm, it lets him cook, do whatever he needs to at night, and it illuminates the area so that if anything is lurking around, he can see it. So it serves as a watch fire as well as a cook fire and warming fire. So you have to remember they didn't have good flashlights back then. If they had a torch, if they lit it, it'd probably only last a few minutes. But then this area could protect the shepherd from the rain and other elements as needed. And over the sheep aren't that worried about being rained on, but they are in need of not having critters jumping over the fence and getting in. So the sheepfolds back in the Bible times were often built with walls made of thorn hedges or of trees or of rocks, depending on what was available to the shepherd under the circumstances. But the good sheepfold was worth a lot when wolves and bears and robbers and lions came around, because it enabled the shepherd to channel that attack into a narrow area. There's a lot of tactical advantages in that simple picture. So, in modern times, what would be the equivalent of the first element? Information. Watching, what do we think of when we think of watching? First thing, beyond just our eyes and ears is optics, binoculars, scopes, night vision, thermal imaging, all those things. Those are all part of watching.
Alertness and
Yep.
not going to sleep.
Guards, having people on duty. You have to learn to have everything in context. The other day I walked into the garden and I noticed a weed going like this. I thought, it's either a bird, a chipmunk, or a gopher. So I started moving right over there, and the plant was still moving, and I couldn't see a thing. So I said, oh, that's a gopher. So I waited for a bit, it didn't move anymore. So I went up there and I just took that plant. It was strawberry spinach about that tall. I took that plant and I just picked it up. It had no root at all. Maybe that much. Just tiny little bit of root. That was that gopher. But you learn to pick up on things like that. Another time we were at my brother-in-law's place and he said, how are you getting so many of these rodents? And I said, I hear their claws on the bark of the trees. So you learn to be in tune with your environment, and being alone is when you can really maximize that awareness, because nobody else is making noise, and it gets down to where the only noise is your own breathing and heartbeat. And you can focus on anything that's going on in your environment. So that's watchfulness. Now prayer, that's communications. A little earlier today we were talking about the vital importance of a radio network, where you have a systematic way of functioning between people with radios, like the law enforcement and medical and fire dispatch systems. We have cellular telephone networks, which are an absolute marvel of technology. Have internet communications, have cameras, have maps. There's all manner of intelligence gathering systems. Human intelligence, signals intelligence, geographic intelligence. So these all come into the category of watching and praying and analyzing information to determine what is truth. So then in the active defenses, like we talked about, the shepherd's staff, or a rod, which in modern terminology, they are two different items. In modern terminology, now the thing about the staff is, it is by far the simplest, cheapest, highly intuitive. There's no reason you can't have one if you're in any kind of a natural setting with trees. And they are very utilitarian and very effective in close range fighting. If you're dealing with a rattlesnake, you can have a knife. Yes, a knife may be a more sophisticated weapon, but the staff will enable you to use that knife. So if all you have is your pocket knife, you don't want to get that close to a striking rattlesnake. But if you have your staff, you can pin it down and use your knife. The staff gives you range that smaller weapons don't give. You know, with a good staff, you can definitely do a lot of disarming of small knives. You don't want to get in there barehanded and try to take a knife away from somebody, but if you have a staff, you have a tremendous advantage.
So would you have the end would be like sharpened, so it's a sharp end?
You can adapt a staff in all kinds of ways.
We just used one with a plain old
Flat end.
flat end to pin snakes.
Sometimes people use a slightly forked end, you know, one with a divot in it to help keep them from slipping out the side. But sometimes they'll hook a noose on it so they can reach out there and slip it over the snake's head and pull it tight. And then they can pick it up and move it and capture it alive or whatever. Can catch grouse that way too. So you have edged weapons, knives, axes, spears, swords. And you have projectile weapons, which can be throwing sticks, rocks, throwing rocks, slings, bows, guns, whatever. Vehicles can be used as weapons. Chemical sprays, chemical weapons, and, you know, on down the list. Like bear spray is a chemical weapon. The Chinese used to just carry the cayenne powder in a paper tube and fling it in the face of an attacker. And passive defenses, what do we have? We have things like fences, walls, doors, locks.
Drawbridges.
Hiding.
Hiding is concealment, which is a passive defense, yes. And you have cover, which is ballistic defense, stopping incoming projectiles. So concealment can interfere with incoming projectiles being directed effectively, but if they guess where you are, those bullets will come right through the cover. I mean, right through the concealment, whereas cover will stop it. It's like most common firearms will stop in about a foot of wood. So if you get behind a tree like that, the only thing you have to watch is on the edges where the bullet might go through and come out the backside. But then you can't just depend on cover or concealment, because an attacker will just come around it. You'll see in a lot of war-torn countries there's sheets hanging up all over the place. You can move around behind those sheets without getting shot at, because they don't see you. Same with smoke. Smoke is an extremely valuable tool to the soldier. You throw out a few grenades and now they can't see you for a little bit. Okay, clothing is a passive defense. Personal protective equipment such as gloves and goggles, breathing protection, body armor, that all falls in the category of passive defenses. Now, when we're comfortably at home or in our vehicles, we have quite a bit of passive protection. But if we're out and about away from our comfortable settings, it can be pretty minimal. So we have to learn to recognize the passive defenses available to us as we move, but it's not quite like home or a fortified position.
Don't you think a rod and the staff are natural?
They're natural weapons, yes.
Or the
You can use them as a shield also, so it's still active defense because you're having to employ it, just like you can use a sword as a shield to stop incoming stuff. Concealment, and also hailstorms, lightning. Those things are definitely weapons in God's arsenal.
Hornets.
Yep, hornets.
ears.
People often say that if people had had more faith, the hornets would have done all the work and they wouldn't have had to do any. But that's not what God says. He says, I'll send the hornets so that the enemy that's running away to hide is chased out of hiding, so that you can find them. And he did send the hornets. You can imagine, though, if you're trying to hide in a hole or in the brush or something, and a horde of bald-faced hornets comes out and begins stinging everything that moves, you are not going to be hidden very long. The reason Jesus stopped Peter from trying to defend him, for one, Peter was vastly overstepping the legitimate laws of self-defense because they had had so many opportunities to escape without the use of force that any use of lethal force under the circumstances was excessive use of force. The mob wasn't trying to kill Jesus or the disciples. They were just making an arrest. Jesus could have easily escaped in at least 4 different ways with his disciples. No property would have been lost. They would have suffered no damage. So they really had nothing there to defend. So the biggest problem was Peter was trying to stop the plan of salvation. He didn't understand what he was doing, but he was trying to stop Christ from going to the cross. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that, okay, what weapons did the disciples have?
Swords.
Had swords, and even on their missionary tours where they couldn't wear shoes or carry money, Jesus allowed them to carry one staff between 2 men. So I guarantee you they had a few staves in the group. So they had swords and staves. What did the mob have that came to arrest Jesus?
Buttons?
What?
Like a button? We would call it a baton today.
Swords and staves.
Same thing, right?
They had the same weapons. Said you could have arrested me easier in the temple, because in the temple police had a pretty strict gun control system where they wouldn't allow any swords or staves to be brought in by the worshipers. So they basically disarmed you at the door. Whereas Christ didn't disarm his disciples.
Interesting.
Now they probably complied with whatever the rules were at the temple, but when they were living out in the wilds, they had swords and staves. Said put it back where it belongs. So there's definitely always that element of training of when to and when not to. That goes for practically everything. Just because you have a hammer doesn't mean that everything is a nail. Just because you have a drill doesn't mean you can drill a hole in anything you want.
Daniel did when he was 3 years old. He drilled.
They gave him a
hole in the
drill
hardwood floor.
for his birthday or something, and he just promptly started drilling holes in the hardwood floor. And, he had to be corrected. So when we give children especially, but anybody, if we entrust them with a tool, they need to have instruction on how to not use it, as well as how
Keeps
to
mothers
use it.
and fathers busy.
It's all part of true education. The other thing is to remember, no matter what the political situation is, if you're free to get out, move around in nature, to where you have a modicum of privacy and where you're allowed to work, you can put all of God's principles into action. We're not dependent on having a perfect government or a perfect economy or a perfect anything.
Being super wealthy.
In fact, God's true education is all about teaching us to operate in unideal, non-permissive environments. The important thing is to have Christ in us, the hope of glory. It's the presence of the Holy Spirit that renders our work effective, and useful. It's that divine guidance. We're just instruments by which the grace of God should be conveyed to the world. You know, God's made every man his brother's keeper. He will require the blood of every man at the hand of his brother. So, we need to do all we can to preserve life. And sometimes that includes dealing with direct or violent threats to life. And sometimes it's just a matter of hard work and industry. Maximizing the usefulness of life. That's what we're here to contend for, is God's right to our service and the service of every other human. I hope that's a blessing.
There it went.
And I hope we can remember those three basic categories and always try to keep those bases covered. So we're wanting to discuss the use of the staff. Now we have staves being whittled here. I trimmed this one up this morning. It took about an hour of work to get it in shape. So why does preparing a staff matter instead of just grabbing a stick when you need it? Well, it can take some careful selection to choose a staff. Some areas don't have a lot of trees and there might not be a stick you can grab. And usually an emergency, when you need it, if it isn't in your hand, you don't have it. So being in the habit, if it's your primary defensive tool, being in the habit of actually carrying your staff all the time is pretty important. When you're in a serious fight where you're exerting lots of strength, your hands are sliding up and down the staff, you don't want those nubbins on there. You don't want rough bark on there. So that's why we take time to prepare a staff. And if we were going to depend on it for a defensive arm, we really ought to practice our strokes. With fencing and other martial arts, there's that basic element of always keeping something between you and your opponent. So you can use it as a shield, and I have not practiced this, so I cannot be an example of how to do it smoothly. But I've investigated just enough to know the principle. You keep that shield moving to deflect any incoming strikes. Then when you make a strike, you're creating an opening for an enemy. So you need to make that strike quickly and get back into your shielding position. Useful work is a great help in learning things like footwork. Those who are active and working constantly instinctively pick up a lot of the basics needed for defensive combat. But as always, the practice of arms is a science in itself and an art. And to be skilled in it, you have to practice it for what it is intended to do, not just an inadvertent application of other work forms to conflict. Here's a lantern that is an old standby of the forest and primitive environments. Sometimes they call it the bug, and other times they probably have some other names for it. It's basically just a tin can candle lantern. So to make it, you basically just punch two holes, one here at the back of the tin can for the bale to go through. It needs to be a metal wire. And then one in the bottom of the can. So when we punch the hole in the bottom of the can, we want the flaps of metal to push inward. And then we insert the candle from the outside toward the inside. Now this was a broken candle, so I used the top end of the candle. But the can does two things. It directs the light in a particular direction, and it also keeps the candle from blowing out easily. So I'll just demonstrate here how it works. Reach inside. Light the candle. And we can see it flickering in the wind. It's obviously getting some wind. We can take and swing it around like we would when we're walking. You know, normally we're carrying it by our side, where it's just. But even with that swinging around and walking, candle's still burning brightly. And when we need more candle, we just push it up. And tapered candle's good because it tends to get a little bit tighter as it goes. Then when this candle's gone, we just push those metal flaps back toward the center again and insert another candle. So those metal flaps, if the candle tries to drop down, will cut into the candle and keep it from falling out too easily.